Is kindness all about me, the giver? Or is kindness when I let go of me? Chazal sagen, as v'schasham Avram Avinu, v'anochi ofa va'ifer. Chazal tell us that as a reward for the fact that Avram Avinu said about himself, I am but dust and ashes. Zochavon l'shtei mitzvahs, the children of Avram Avinu merited 2 mitzvahs, which are efer para, the ashes of the para aduma, v'afar soita, and the sand that is scattered onto the water given to the soita woman. Now, reward is not an arbitrary thing when Hashem gives it out. As Yodua, we know, as the Eibishter gets schar in our oifim from midah keneged midah, we know that the way that the Eibishter gives reward is in line with and appropriate with what the person did to deserve it. As if which makes it clear in our case as well, as the shaychas von die zwei mitzvahs, efer para v'apar soita, the link between these 2 mitzvahs, the ashes of the paraduma and the soita water, or at least the sand of that soita water, the link between that, to the fact that Avram Avinu referred to himself as dust and ashes, is not just because he used those words, and these mitzvahs are associated with those words, offer va'ifer. Now, weil der Teichen von die zwei mitzvahs ist ähnlich zum Teichen von Anagos Avram. It's because what the content, the meaning behind these 2 mitzvahs, and specifically the ashes and the dust of those 2 mitzvahs, is related to the theme from Anagos Avram, even from Anochi Offer Va'ifer, to the way in which Avram Avinu behaved like dust and ashes, which means Anova v'shiflus betachlis, absolute extreme humility and lowliness. So what is the deeper thematic link between Avram Avinu's conduct and these 2 mitzvahs? Now, when you think about it, actually, at least the first of these 2 mitzvahs seems to be contrary to what Avram Avinu is all about. It would appear that the deeper meaning of the Para Aduma is very much the opposite of the energy of Avram Avinu. Because Midas Shel Avram is Midas Chesed. The attribute of Avram Avinu is kindness. Avram, Oyavi, as the Pasuk in Yeshaya says, that Avram is one who loves Hashem. Kiyodua, as Avram is given a nodiv, b'mahmoinai, b'gufoi, uvenafshai, as we know that Avram Avinu was generous financially with his person and with his soul. B'zazamra Midas Chesed, kol yomai, kol yimei chulei, Avram, omad sham b'mkaimi. To the extent that the Sefer HaBorah tells us that as long as Avraham Avinu was alive, Midas HaChesed of Atzilus said, I have no job. Avraham Avinu has completely overtaken my role. He replaced Midas HaChesed. So everything about Avraham Avinu is Chesed, and everything about the Paraduma is Gevura. Mashenken Paraduma is in Yana Gevura B'Tachlis. The Paraduma represents absolute Gevura. V'shteit in Zoyar as Para de Kabilas means Simola. First of all, the Zoyar tells us that the Para comes from the left side, as we know in the Merkava, the divine chariot, that there are various apparitions of various creatures, and the ox is to the left, which is the side of Gevura. Especially when you consider what the Arizal says, that it's not called Par Adon, but Para Aduma. As Para B'Tesefes Hey is Meramazef Diala Hey Gvuros. So the Arizal says the Hey at the end of Para represents the 5 different types of Gevura. So it's the full spectrum of Gevura represented by this Para. Not only that, und there too is as Paraduma, and it's a red heifer. The color red is the symbolic color of Gevura. Not only that, it has to be absolutely red. You can't even have more than 2 hairs that are not red. Gevura is betachlis. That means it's absolute extreme Gevura. How can you link that to Avraham Avinu? And not only that, the Medrash even tells us, as the Alefir Tnoim Bapara, the 4 adjectives that describe the rules of the Para, which is Aduma, it has to be red, Tmima, perfectly red, Asherim B'Mum, cannot have a blemish, Asheloi Ola Aleha Oil, and can never have carried a yoke, Geinof Tefir Golios. Those are all symbolic of the 4 major exiles after Yetzias Mitzrayim that the Jewish people experienced, which is a concept of Gevura. So then, had we made the comparison between Avraham Avinu and the water which is used to mix the ashes of the paraduma into, to sprinkle onto the contaminated person, then it wouldn't be such a big surprise for us. Because water which always descends from a higher to a lower place, as Alter Rebbe tells us in Tanya, water represents chesed. That would link to Avraham Avinu. Especially when you consider the kind of water that had to be used for the paraduma process. that had to come from living waters, which is a spring that doesn't dry up. But that's not what we're comparing. We're comparing the ashes of the Paraduma to Avraham Avinu's personality. That is ash that comes from the cow, which is para gevuros, aduma gevuros, tmima absolute gevuros. How do you link that to Avraham Avinu, who's ish hachesed? So in order to understand that, we have to appreciate that there are two possible causes for why a person would share chesed. Shlomo de Birindem, the explanation is this. Aside from chesed, there are two ways that Chassidus describes about how chesed operates. Ein ofen is chesed mitzad hagdula. One type of chesed is where a person shares chesed because of their greatness. In other words, like you see, if somebody's a great king, or a very senior member of the government, or a very wealthy individual, because they feel so empowered in their position, they feel that they are so extravagant, therefore they're so generous. And they are magnanimous, and they give all kinds of extravagance to people, great people, not so great people, etc. When you have chesed driven by a sense of greatness, a sense of means, that can evolve into an inappropriate kind of chesed di Yishmael, the grandeur of Yishmael, where they do the same kind of thing. It's all about opulence and it's all about extravagance, but it's all about illustrating through their so-called kindness how great they are. So you've got kindness, which is because I feel great, therefore I want to share, which could result in kindness that shows you how great I am. The kind of kindness that is associated with Yishmael is arrogant, to show off the wealth and the greatness and the beauty and the extravagance, etc. That's one kind of chesed. Zweite from the chesed is, then it's a completely different root of chesed, which is chesed d'Avram, the kind of chesed that Avraham Avinu represents, which is what we're talking about. That is chesed driven by the exact opposite, by bittul, by self-surrender, by lowliness, seeing oneself as dust and ashes. Because Avraham Avinu saw himself as smaller or less significant than others, to borrow a phrase from the Gemara, the person who makes himself just like leftovers. That's we speak about that with Mechila, right? That the Eibusher forgives those who make themselves like shirayim. Because Avraham Avinu doesn't see himself as a central figure, the exact opposite of chesed digdula, so therefore he has to give, he has to share, he has to help everybody else. Was der Uftu und Yisem Meile in dem Eufen Ashpos Chesed is nicht nur in dem, was ist bei sich Bot was schaffen mir oid. So the advantage of this approach to Chesed is not only that the source of the Chesed, the person, the practitioner of the Chesed, is very humble, believing that everybody else is actually more important than them. And therefore, as a result, the person gives everything to everyone else. And he just lives by, the basics of what he needs, the so-called leftovers. Whereas the person whose chesed is because of their greatness, hangs on to the majority of its assets for himself, and he gives the excess to other people. But that's not all. It's not just that chesed, based in bittul, is willing to give and just retain the minimum for oneself. But it's even more than that. The Alter Rebbe tells us, even if harm will come to the person because of the chesed that he's showing, that would not delay him in sharing chesed, because there's no self-interest at all. It is chesed driven by absolute bittul. And that's exactly what you see in Avram's experience. Why does Avraham Avinu share chesed? Not because he thinks I'm such a wealthy, great person, and therefore I'm going to show how magnanimous I am, but rather that he's coming from a perspective of Ve'efer. I'm nobody. Not only was he willing to risk his physical well-being and his life to help somebody else, Wird erzählt in Parshas Lech, as we see in Parshas Lech Lecha. Was dort ist der erste Sipur Mefeirash von Avram Sisaskas and Midas HaChesed, which is really where we see the first example of Avram Avinu's engagement in Chesed. As to the dominion from Pidyon Shvuyim, that in order to rescue a captive, in this case his nephew Lot, and of course we understand that even in the world of Chesed, Pidyon Shvuyim is considered high priority, ultimate form of Chesed. Avram gestellt in Sakona. Avram risked his life, he went to war. And not just any war, but a war against very powerful kings. But that's not all. Not only was Avram Avinu willing to sacrifice his physical well-being, even his physical life, for Chesed, but he even sacrificed his own spiritual value and gains for Chesed. We see at the beginning of this week's parasha, when Avram Avinu saw the three men who, as we know, were malachim disguised as men, Avram Avinu says to the Eibishter, please wait for me, so I can go and welcome in these guests. In other words, das heißt, for the sake of welcoming guests, is by Avram giving the recht zu überreisen in von Kabbalah's Pnei Shechina. Avram Avinu was willing to rip himself away from the opportunity to be face to face with Hashem, with the Shechina. To the extent that the Gemara in Shabbos and Shavuos has slight variations of how you say the sentence, but basically the Gemara says that from here we learn that welcoming guests is greater than accommodating the Shechina. So that's the kind of chesed that Avram has. So Hadover movement, as for Avram, when you think about it, it makes sense that for somebody like Avram, his life was not about material things. No, his whole life was about spiritual value. Is the oblos and akpolos pnei Shechina aggressive mesiras nefesh for Avram Avinu to step away from having an engagement with the Shechina was greater sacrifice and aggressive bein aroich. In fact, exponentially so, than to put his life on the line. And yet he did it for Chesed. Now let's think, not only for Chesed, who's he doing this Chesed for? Noch mehr. Furthermore, to the welche Orchim hat Avram übergerissen der Matze von Akbalas Pnei Shechina. For which kind of guests did Avram Avinu tear himself away from being face to face with the Eibishter? For the kind of guests that in his estimation were that they were Arabs who bowed to the dust of their feet. Not just regular idolaters, not der niederigster, the lowest form of idolaters. They bow to the dust under their feet, meaning to say that their whole belief system is around something which is so useless, so lowly, that it's even lower than human feet. That open from Avodah Zarah, that kind of Avodah Zarah, for them, Avram Avinu's chesed drives him to give up the opportunity to engage with Eibusha, to go help these people. Kommt das. As Avram hat sich abgerissen von der höchste Darges Beruchnis, this is the Indian von Akbalas Pnei Shechina, which illustrates that Avram Avinu pulled himself away from the very highest experience of divine interaction. Because think about it, even when Avram Avinu is not in that experience of Vayeira of Hashem, where he sees Hashem face to face, his whole life he was a vehicle only dedicated to and doing what the Eibishter wants. As the Alter Rebbe tells us in Tanya about Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, as kol yameim la'olam, their entire life, lo yifsiku afilu shah achas, they didn't pause even temporarily from from being the Eibishter's vehicle, the Eibishter's tool, the Eibishter's expression in this world. So imagine somebody who's at that level all their life, how elevated it is for them to experience the Eibishter, seeing the Eibishter face to face. And he gives that up. For what? He gives all of that up to go help people whose entire life, at least from what he could tell, is the exact antithesis of what he's experiencing. He's having divine revelation at the highest level and relinquishing that to look after people who serve Avodah Zarah at the very lowest level. Where did Avram Avinu even get the capacity to do this? The fact that Yidden through the generations now go and prioritize having guests is nikin chiddush. That's not so surprising. Because because we now have a direct instruction in the Torah. That from Avram Avinu, the Torah instructs us that it is greater to welcome guests than to entertain the Shekhinah. But where did Avram learn it from? There's no precedent. How does he know this? So it's not something he learned, it's who he is. No, Avram is kanal, given betachlas habitul. That's because Avram Avinu lives with complete surrender and dedication to Hashem. He sees himself as no more than dust and ashes. So therefore, it's absolutely clear in his mind as whoever it is, no matter who they are, takes priority over him. Bis die eigene Ruchnis darf man weglegen on our side, so helfen als zweiten Begashmis. To the extent that it is worthwhile to put aside, to ignore my own spiritual value and gain in favor of somebody else's physical needs. Now that we understand where Avram Avinu comes from, and that yes, Avram is Isha Chesed, but his Chesed is a Chesed built on Bittul, complete surrender to Hashem, then we can link his expression, I am dust and ashes, to these two mitzvahs of Paraduma and Soita. Weil der Kiyum von die zwei Mitzvahs ist verbunden dafke mit dem Hergesh HaChesed, wie das Kum von Vanoichi auf Vayeira. Because both of these mitzvahs are built on that kind of sentiment, on that kind of connection to Hashem, which is total bittul. The kind of experience Avram had. Which means, practically, to sich moise nefesh sein, beruchnis, zu lieb helpen atzveten. To be willing to sacrifice spiritual gain to help somebody else, which tells me that it's true sacrifice, it's true Mesiras Nefesh. If I'm willing to give up neshama value for somebody else's needs, that's real Mesiras Nefesh. So where do we see that? In both of these mitzvahs. The din by Paraduma is, as we well know, Paraduma has this paradoxical reality that as that any person involved in the ritual of the Paraduma becomes impure. As far as from them Kohen, so what's required is that the Kohen vas inyanis kedusha v'tara u'lashoris bebeis hamikdash. His entire life is about purity and about holiness and about serving in the Beis Hamikdash, all ruchnistic values. As he has to relinquish that greatness and go to the opposite extreme to expose himself to become impure. Und durch dem nicht kennen die Arbeit in the Beis Hamikdash, which means he cannot now do his role to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. Why is he doing that? To help another Jew to become pure again. The theme of Ofar Vayeira, the willingness to prioritize everything over myself, even over my spirituality. And who is the Kohen helping over here? But what kind of a Jew does the Kohen have to expose himself to become impure? A Jew who had been exposed to a dead body, which is the most extreme version of Tumah that exists. Which represents spiritually, as long as a Jew is plugged into the Eibishter, connected to the Eibishter, it's not possible for the person to experience death or impurity. As the Pasuk tells us, those of you who cleave to Hashem, you're alive today. The impurity of death implies separateness from the Eibishter, disconnect. And such an extreme version of disconnect that it's the impurity of a dead body. And for that Jews in such a spiritual mess, we demand of the Kohen that he should ignore his own spiritual requirements and contaminate himself. At least that way he can help another Jew to be purified. Like Avram Avinu, sacrificing everything to help another person. A very similar thing applies to Soita, although here it's not in the context of the Kohen per se, it's actually in the context of the Eibishter. The uftu from a Soita is, as last is Sholem benishli ishtom Torah. So the whole purpose of the Soita process is, the Torah says, in order to recreate harmony between a husband and wife, the Torah says, Shmi shenichta b'kedusha yimocheh alamayim. That the Eibishter says, my name that was written in holiness should be erased in this water, dissolved in this water. Surely there's no greater desecration of holiness than to actively erase Hashem's name. And yet we do it. For the purpose of recreating Shalom Bayis, we erase Hashem's name. And who are we talking about over here? The only reason that the woman landed up in this situation was because she conducted herself in a way that is the opposite of modesty. And she was warned by her husband not to continue this way. And she ignored it. She ignored her husband and she went into private quarters with somebody she should never have been with. We're talking about somebody who's really not in a healthy spiritual state. Deswegen sagt Torah, and yet the Torah says, in order to recreate peace between the husband and that wife who completely ignored his concerns, it is required, not only is it allowed, it is required to erase Hashem's name in order to facilitate peace between these couple, between this husband and wife. So now we have explained the connection between Avram Avinu calling himself dust and ashes and the concept of the Para Aduma, which is that it's all about chesed derived from bittul, where you give up everything in order to help the other person, even at the expense to yourself, as happens in the Para Aduma. Will help us understand a story that Zohar relates, which is on the topic of Para Aduma. In Zohar itself, that the Zohar tells a story as Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair had gebeten by Rabbi, as was sagen, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair went to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and he asked him, please, would you tell me a chiddush, a new insight into something to do with the Para Aduma, Parshas Chukas. Rabbi didn't do it. Rabbi gebeten as Rabbi Elazar ben Noi, so sagen milachad. So Rabbi asked Rabbi Elazar, his son, you say a word. And Rabbi Elazar had a geton, which he did. It's a Tatam Avori in Zayin HaOretz of Zohar, so the Rebbe's father explains in his commentary on Zohar, that time was Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair gewollt am Milchad to Parshas Para Aduma dafka. Why is it that Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair wanted specifically to learn a new insight into the laws of Para Aduma out of all the areas of Torah? Why didn't he just go to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and say, teach me some new Torah? As das der Fall, as he explains, was Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, who al derech Avram Avinu. So the Rebbe's father explains, because Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, his character is similar to the character of Avraham Avinu. In other words, his concept, his spiritual purpose is similar to Avraham Avinu. Seeing as Avraham Avinu refers to himself as dust and ashes, and because he referred to himself as ashes, that earned his children the mitzvah Para Aduma, because Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair has the sole connection to Avraham Avinu, who is compared to Efer, which links to the Para Aduma. So Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair wanted to learn something special about the Para Aduma. Okay, we get that. The question is, why didn't Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai answer him? And actually, for that matter, if Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair is so deeply connected to this concept of Para Aduma, why does he need somebody else to teach him a chiddush? It doesn't make sense. When you realize that the whole idea of Para Aduma is embedded or linked to the persona, the spiritual makeup of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, why was he not the person who came up with an innovative insight into Para Aduma? Surely he is the best person for the job. And once he asked Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai the question, then is, was Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair hat ihm gebeten sagen, clearly the reason Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair decided to ask Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai to tell him about the Para Aduma is because he realized that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai has a link to Para Aduma. As the Rebbe's father explains, still Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai himself didn't give the word. He calls on Rabbi Elazar. Why? Now, with the information we've learned, as die Scheichs von euch auf der Wefe zu Para Aduma ist mit Zadan Hoge von Avraham Avinu b'mid das Chesed in an Eifen von Bittul, when we understand and appreciate that the link between Eifer Para and Avraham Avinu is that it's Chesed, which is motivated by Bittul, where the Bittul causes me to give up everything I'm concerned with in favor of helping somebody else. Yes, Shlomo, we could explain. The Scheichs bepashas zwischen Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair mit Chesed Avraham is the most obvious connection between Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair and Avraham, who is the icon of Chesed, is was man gefindt, as Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair hat sich also gewähnt in Pidyon Shvoim, because you find Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair dedicated a lot of time and energy into redeeming captives. Was kanal is das der Sipur in Torah wegen Chesed Avraham. And as we've mentioned, the first story the Torah tells us of Avram's chesed is a story of Pidyon Shvuim. Was das a chesed, was verbunden mit Einstellen sich in Sakone zu liberaten mit einer zweiten. And, as we've already pointed out, that redeeming captives is a mitzvah where the person risks their own life in order to help somebody else and possibly save their life. From Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair to Chesed Avram. So that's the link, that unique link between Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair and Avram's Chesed, which is, I'll give up myself for the purpose of somebody else. So Velchem is Zeichet Sefer Parah, which gives the opportunity to earn the Efer Parah. Had Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair gewollt ausdrücken in dem Inyan Gufa. Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair wanted to illustrate that point in the way he went about learning a new insight about Parah Aduma. Of Uftan Amirachat and Pashas Parah Aduma, he wanted to bring about an innovative insight into Parah Aduma, but he wanted to do it in the way of Chesed Avram, which means to be the one to innovate a new perspective in Torah is a tremendous schus. And he decided he doesn't need that schus for himself, but rather instead, he'll give Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai their opportunity. There's chesed, davram. I'm giving up what could benefit me for the sake of somebody else. Instead of me being the one who innovates this new chiddush, let Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai have the schus. That is spiritual or soul sacrifice to do for somebody else. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai did the same. But there said Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, if there's ein schus gedei, as Rabbi Lozer Menoi soll haben dem schus. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai followed suit, and he also relinquished the opportunity to be the one to innovate this new perspective about Parah Aduma, and he gave it instead to his son Rabbi Elazar. And it's interesting to note that the Rebbe's father points out, as Rabbi Elazar is al derech Moshe Parah asas beElazar HaKohen. The fact that Rabbi Elazar was the one to give this chiddush about Parah Aduma resonates with the fact that the first Parah Aduma was produced by Elazar HaKohen, Aaron HaKohen's son, which, by the way, is the same thing. Aaron, the Kohen Gadol, relinquished his rights to have the opportunity to Parah Aduma, to do a chesed to his son Elazar, that he should have that opportunity. Now that we understand what chesed davram means, that it's the kind of chesed where a person is willing to compromise everything, even the greatest benefits, even the greatest spiritual benefits, to help somebody else, now we can understand why this is all associated with the ashes of the Parah Aduma, specifically not the meichatas, because we said meichatas, water, that sounds much more like Avram Avinu's speed. Water is the symbol of chesed. Why is it the Efer specifically? Because Avram Avinu, as a person of chesed, was not exclusively all about chesed. The Efer Hanal from Chesed Avram, the kind of chesed that Avram exhibits, the fact that he's willing to sacrifice his own spiritual benefits in order to help another person, is verbunden damit. That's because in order for Avram Avinu to express his chesed, he also had to use the power of Gvura. Like the explanation goes to the pasuk as follows: If the Mishnah says, "Why do I love Avram Avinu? Because I know him." Because he's going to instruct his family to do tzedakah and mishpat. Tzedakah is tzedakah, charity. Mishpat is justice. What's the pshat? As it's tzedakah from Avram is given verbunden mit mishpat. The way in which Avram shares tzedakah is first based on mishpat, on judgment. First Avram Avinu judges himself. He first budgeted how much he requires for himself. And the way he decided how much he needed for himself was in the strictest possible way. Absolute gevura. Calculating that what he is allowed to retain for himself has to be the absolute minimum. And all the rest he gave to tzedakah. In other words, the lion's share he gave to tzedakah. And he calculated what is the bare minimum to survive, and I'll keep that for myself. That's gevura, motivating chesed. This kind of conduct, where gevura supports and assists chesed to happen, that is an expression of complete bittul represented by am das den ashes. Pshas der chesed kommt mitzad bittul, when chesed is driven by bittul, by losing self, demult is a chesed nit by grenes ein tel for mention. In that case, the chesed is not limited to one component of the human. Chesed in dem tzir for mitzvah chesed. Chesed which looks like chesed. Chesed which behaves like chesed. Now, es nimmt durch alle Teilen von der Menschen. When the basis is bittul, then the impact is right across the entire persona. To the extent that he's able to invoke Gevura and transform Gevura. By nature, Gevura is the opposite of Chesed. But because Avram is operating with bittul, everybody loses that interest in I have to be me. And even Gevura can be used as a means of achieving Chesed. Gevura doesn't have to hang on to Gevura. That's why the position that Avram took, that I am dust and ashes, brought about access to these two mitzvahs of Paraduma and Saita. It's because the whole concept of Avram Avinu's bittul is not something that expresses itself in pure chesed, which would then equate to the water associated with the paraduma. Because water is chesed. The ultimate is that you transform the gvura into chesed. That's the ultimate achievement. That's what happens when you burn the paraduma. The paraduma is a symbol of gevura. What do? You burn the paraduma. You dismantle that gevura. You sweeten the gevura. And that's what makes the ashes of the paraduma. Okay, in the Torah, as the Alter Rebbe points out, beautiful, based on what we saw earlier from the Arizal, as das it in von Efer. That's what the word Efer represents. As anstatt par hey, we take the par, which is already a symbol of Gevura, and the hey, which is a symbol of the hey Gevuras. Was weiß if the hey Gevuras can also Aleph. Vert Efer, we change it into Efer, which is Aleph par. That is an Aleph before the par. Was the Aleph that Aleph represents Gevura at its source. At its source, you have the capacity to completely convert Gevura from being something harsh and something very limiting to something powerful and something which generates even greater chesed than what the person would have done of their own accord with just regular chesed. And you see the same concept with the sand of the soita. You have bitter waters that you have to give the soita to drink. And the afara soita turns that bitter water, as amorim gevuros, that the bitter waters, which represent gevura, extreme gevura, enough gevura that could actually end this woman's life. So luftun tipula shel chesed turns into an action, turns into a process of chesed, v'niksav and Israel zara, that she's able to become fertile and to be able to have children. Bittul, it gives us the capacity not only to do chesed in the best way possible, but to transform the harshness of gevura to become part of the journey of chesed.